In the early hours of January 15, 1966, Nigeria woke up to gunfire. Before sunrise, soldiers were already on the move. In Lagos, Kaduna, Ibadan, units began taking positions quietly under the cover of darkness. Then it escalated. Political leaders were pulled out of their homes. In some areas, there were exchanges of gunfire between loyal troops and the officers leading the revolt. Within a few hours, the balance of power in the country had shifted. Nigeria's Prime Minister, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, was arrested that night. His body would later be discovered days after. In Kaduna, the premier of the northern region, Ahmadu Bello, was killed in his residence. And in Ibadan, the premier of the western region, Samuel Ladoke Kintola, was also assassinated. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated. The operation was carried out by a group of young army majors, men who believed the country was collapsing under corruption, ethnic division, and political failure. At the center of it all was a 29-year-old officer, Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. To them, this wasn't just a coup. It was a correction. Their objective was clear: remove the existing leadership and rebuild the system from the ground up. But here's where everything changed. The coup didn't succeed the way they planned. It was only partially executed. While they took control in some regions, especially in the north, the operation failed in Lagos, the seat of power. And that failure created a dangerous imbalance, because most of the political and military figures killed that night were from one region of the country, the north. That perception, whether intentional or not, changed how the entire event was seen. What started as a revolution quickly became viewed as something else entirely, a sectional coup. And from that moment, Nigeria began to fracture. The military stepped in, but not to restore democracy. Instead, it marked the beginning of military rule. What followed was a brutal chain reaction, counter-coups, deep ethnic tension, and by 1967, a full-scale civil war. The events of that single night didn't just end Nigeria's first republic. They reshaped the country's future permanently. To understand why the coup happened, we have to go back a few years, back to 1960, when Nigeria gained independence from the United Kingdom. At that time, the mood was hopeful. Nigeria had everything going for it: a large population, vast natural resources, and real potential to become a leading force in Africa. But beneath that optimism, there was a problem. The political system wasn't truly united. It was divided. Nigeria was structured around three powerful regions, and each one was dominated by its own political leader and party. In the north, Ahmadu Bello led the Northern People's Congress. In the west, Obafemi Awolowo was the dominant political force. And in the east, Nnamdi Azikiwe held influence as one of the country's most powerful figures. Now, instead of building a strong national identity, politics became a battle for regional control. Each region was looking out for itself. Elections were heavily disputed, with widespread accusations of rigging and manipulation. Opposition figures were harassed, arrested, sometimes completely pushed out of the system. And then came the breaking point. In the western region, political tensions exploded into open violence. There were riots, arson, killings. The crisis became so severe that the region earned a nickname, the Wild West. This wasn't just politics anymore. It was instability, right in the open. And while all of this was happening, the military was watching. Young officers, many of them educated, disciplined, and frustrated, began to lose faith in the civilian leadership. From their perspective, the politicians weren't fixing the country. They were exploiting it. Corruption was rising. The system looked broken, and inside the barracks, a dangerous idea started to form. Maybe the army needed to step in, not just to restore order, but to take control. As the crisis deepened, some young military officers began to act, quietly and in secret. They started planning a takeover. At the center of it all was a young major, Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. He was known for his discipline, his intensity, and his belief that Nigeria was drifting in the wrong direction. To him, this wasn't just politics. It was betrayal. Another key figure was Emmanuel Ifejuna. He wasn't just a soldier, he had represented Nigeria at the Olympics, a symbol of national pride. But now, he was part of something very different, and they weren't alone. A small group of young officers, frustrated, ambitious, and convinced they were right, came together around the same idea. The system had failed, and it needed to be forcefully reset. The plan they came up with was bold, simple, on paper. They would strike at the same time, across multiple cities, Lagos, Kaduna, Ibadan. Key political leaders would be arrested. Some eliminated. Once that was done, the military would step in, take control, and announce a new government, one that, in their minds, would end corruption and restore order. But here's the problem. A coup doesn't fail because of ambition. It fails because of execution. And this plan had cracks in it from the start. Poor coordination, uneven support within the military, and a dangerous assumption that everything would go exactly as planned. It wouldn't. What they were about to trigger was something far bigger than a simple takeover. As the chaos spread, the military moved fast to contain it. Not the coup plotters, but the senior command. At the center of that response was Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi. He was the most senior officer in the Nigerian army at the time. And in a moment where authority had collapsed, rank mattered. So he stepped in, took control of the situation, stabilized the chain of command. And within days, he made it official. The constitution was suspended, and Nigeria now had a military head of state. Just like that, the First Republic was over. No election, no transition. Power had shifted from civilians to the military. For the first time in Nigeria's history, soldiers were now in charge of the government. But here's the part that changed everything. The coup may have failed structurally, but its consequences were already locked in. Because across northern Nigeria, a narrative was forming that the coup wasn't just about corruption or fixing the system. It was seen as targeted. Most of the political leaders killed were from the north, and that perception, whether fully accurate or not, created deep resentment, not just among civilians, but inside the military itself. Trust broke down. Suspicion replaced unity. And once that happens in a military structure, you don't have stability anymore. You have a countdown. 6 months later, that tension exploded. In July 1966, another group of officers carried out a counter-coup. This time, it was brutal, and it was personal. General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi was overthrown and killed. Out of that second coup, a new leader emerged, Yakubu Gowon, young, relatively unknown at the time, but now in control of a deeply divided country. And by this point, the pattern was clear. Power would no longer change through elections. It would be taken. What started in January 1966 wasn't just a single coup. It was the beginning of a cycle: military intervention, retaliation, instability. And that cycle would define Nigeria for years to come. The events of January 1966 didn't just interrupt Nigeria's political journey. They changed it permanently. In a matter of days, civilian rule collapsed, and in its place, the military stepped in. What was supposed to be a short-term intervention became something much longer. Over the years that followed, coups became a pattern. 1966 didn't end with one takeover. It set a precedent. Power could be seized, and once that door was opened, it didn't close easily. Nigeria would go on to experience multiple coups and counter-coups, stretching across decades. But the deeper consequence came almost immediately, because the instability created in 1966 didn't stay contained. It escalated. By 1967, the country was at war. The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Nigerian Civil War, began when the eastern region attempted to break away and form an independent state called Biafra. What followed was one of the deadliest conflicts in African history. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 3 million people died, many from starvation, not just combat. Millions more were displaced, families torn apart, communities destroyed. a nation pushed to its limits, and even after the war ended in 1970, the impact didn't disappear. The scars remained, politically, economically, and psychologically. They still do. Looking back, the officers who carried out the January coup believed they were acting in the country's best interest. They saw themselves as correctors, not destroyers. But history doesn't judge intention, it judges outcomes. And the outcome was a chain reaction, one that reshaped Nigeria for generations. So the question still stands. Was the coup an attempt to save Nigeria from collapse? Or was it the moment that pushed the country into something even more unstable? That answer depends on how you see the consequences.